the long journey across the ocean. Imagine closing your eyes and drifting back in time to the early 17th century. The year is 1620. The Atlantic Ocean stretches endlessly, dark and vast, its waters rising and falling with the rhythm of the wind. On this ocean, a small wooden ship sails slowly forward. Its name is the Mayflower. Inside the ship are men, women, and children, about 100 souls, seeking a new life. They have left behind the cobblestone streets of England, the gray skies of the old world, and the familiar comforts of their towns and villages. The air inside the ship is thick with the scent of damp wood and salted meat. Space is cramped. Families sleep side by side, with only thin blankets for warmth. At night, the ship creaks and groans with every wave, and the travelers whisper prayers for safety. For weeks, the journey continues. The days blur into one another. Salt spray stings their faces. The ocean seems endless, but in their hearts burns a small flame of hope that across this great water, there lies a land where they can worship freely, build homes, and live by their own rules. At last, after more than 2 months at sea, the cry is heard. Land, land! Through the mist, a dark coastline appears. Forests stretch tall and silent. Rivers wind their way through the hills. It is wild, untamed, and beautiful. This is New England, a place unlike any they have known before. Evergreen Tree, the first glimpse of New England. When the settlers step onto the shore, the air feels sharp and clean. The scent of pine drifts on the breeze. Under their feet, the sand is cold, and the cries of unseen birds echo through the forest. This new land is quiet, but it is not empty. Native people have walked these woods for thousands of years, though for now, they watch from a distance. The newcomers see vast forests, rivers filled with fish, and soil that promises crops if only they can survive long enough to plant them. Winter, however, is already near. Snow begins to fall. The settlers have no houses, only the shelter of makeshift tents and the ship they sailed on. Food grows scarce. Many fall sick. At night, the howling of wolves echoes in the woods, reminding them of their isolation. But still, they hold on. With determination, they begin to cut down trees, to build small wooden houses with steep roofs to shed the snow. They dig the frozen earth to make storage pits for food. By the spring, those who survive have begun to shape the beginnings of colony. It is fragile, uncertain, and yet full of possibility. Homes of the colonists. The first homes in New England were simple and rough. Picture a small wooden hut, its walls made from logs notched and stacked together. The roof is steep, covered with thatch or wooden shingles so that rain and snow slide off. Inside, the air smells of smoke from the hearth. A fire burns in the stone fireplace, the only source of warmth through the long winter nights. Around the fire, the family gathers. They cook meals in iron pots hung on hooks and bake bread in the coals. The floor is bare earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw. A rough wooden table stands in the center, with benches on either side. Beds are little more than straw mattresses, stuffed into wooden frames. In one corner, children sleep huddled together under woolen blankets. Candles made from tallow provide a dim light, their flickering flames casting shadows on the walls. Outside the small windows, the forest looms dark, vast, and full of unknown sounds. Though the houses are modest, to the settlers they are a symbol of survival. Every log, every stone, every shingle is proof that they are carving out a life in this new land. Daily work and survival. Life in New England is not easy. Each day begins at dawn, when the rooster crows and the first light filters into the house. Men rise to chop wood, mend tools, and tend to the fields. Women prepare breakfast, cornmeal porridge perhaps, or bread with a little butter if they are lucky. Children are not idle. Even the youngest help with chores, carrying water from the well, gathering eggs, or watching the small animals. The settlers grow corn, beans, and squash, crops taught to them by the native people. In time, they also plant wheat, barley, and rye, brought from Europe. Hunting provides venison, wild turkey, and sometimes rabbit. Fishing in the rivers yields cod, herring, and trout. Food is precious. Every meal is measured carefully, and nothing is wasted. In the fall, families preserve what they can, drying fish, smoking meat, storing apples and pumpkins in cool cellars. The work never ends. In summer, they labor under the hot sun, clearing land and building fences. In winter, they struggle to keep warm, patching holes in walls, and praying that their stores of food will last until spring. Faith and community. For the settlers, faith is central. On Sundays, the entire community gathers in a small wooden meeting house. Inside, the air is cold, for fires are forbidden during worship, and everyone sits on hard wooden benches. The preacher speaks of duty, of discipline, of the need to live godly lives in this new world. Children are expected to sit still and silent, listening for hours. For many, religion is not only a belief, but the very reason they cross the ocean. The community is close-knit. Neighbors help one another, for survival depends on cooperation. When a house must be built, men gather to raise the frame together. When crops must be harvested, families work side by side. And when sickness comes, as it often does, prayers are whispered together for mercy and healing. Night in the colonies. As the sun sets, shadows lengthen across the clearing. Smoke curls from the chimneys, carrying with it the smell of stew and fresh bread. Families gather by the firelight, telling stories or reading from the Bible. Outside, the forest is alive with sounds, the cry of owls, the rustle of deer moving through brush, the distant howl of wolves. The night is both peaceful and unsettling. Children climb into their straw beds, wrapped in blankets. Parents bank the fire, covering it with ashes so that it smolders through the night. Candles are blown out. Darkness fills the room. In the silence, the settlers dream of the lives they left behind in England and of the uncertain future that awaits them here in New England. This is just the beginning. In the next part, we will explore more about colonial New England, the roles of men and women, education, trade, relations with Native Americans, and the rhythms of everyday life in the 1600s. The role of men. In the New England colonies of the 17th century, the role of men was shaped by survival. Each dawn, men rose with the first light, their tasks heavy and unending. They chopped wood, mended fences, and cared for livestock. They hunted in the forest for venison and turkey, or spent long hours fishing in cold rivers and along the rocky coasts. But their labor did not end with food. They built the homes, shaped the tools, and defended the settlement from danger. In times of trouble, men gathered with muskets to form a militia, standing watch against threats both human and wild. At night, weary from work, they sat by the hearth, often in silence, sharpening tools or mending boots. Their strength was the backbone of the colony, and their authority extended into the household, where they were expected to lead their families with discipline and faith. The role of women. The life of women was no less demanding. From the first glow of morning, they began their duties. They prepared food, often starting with simple porridge of cornmeal. They baked bread, churned butter, and tended gardens of herbs and vegetables. Women spun wool, wove cloth, and sewed the family's clothing by hand. Every stitch was careful, for cloth was precious, and garments had to last through many seasons. They cared for the children, teaching them manners, prayers, and the skills needed for daily survival. Women also nursed the sick, using herbs such as sage, mint, and willow bark, knowledge often learned from native people. When husbands were away, hunting, fishing, or traveling, women managed the household alone, keeping the fire burning, the animals fed, and the children safe. In the dim candlelight of evening, mothers often read softly from the Bible, their voices steady and calm, weaving faith into the lives of their families. The life of children. Children in colonial New England lived lives far different from children today. Their days were filled with work. From a very young age, they carried water, gathered firewood, and watched animals. Girls helped their mothers with spinning and cooking, while boys followed their fathers into fields or the forest. Play was rare, though sometimes they carved simple toys from wood or played games with stones. Education was important to the Puritans. Reading the Bible was seen as a duty, and so children were taught their letters as soon as possible. Many villages had small schools, often just a single room where a stern schoolmaster taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. Discipline was strict. A child who misbehaved might be struck with a switch or made to stand in shame. Yet through these hardships, the children grew into strong, resilient adults, ready to take on the responsibilities of survival, trade, and barter. In those early years, money was scarce. Instead, most trade was done by barter. A bushel of corn might be exchanged for a length of cloth. A pair of shoes could be traded for a jug of molasses. Farmers brought their goods to small markets, where neighbors met to exchange what they had. A hunter might trade venison for a sack of flour. A fisherman might barter salted cod for candles or soap. Over time, as the colonies grew, trade expanded. Ships sailed back to England, carrying timber, furs, and fish, and returned with tools, nails, fabric, and books. Slowly, the colonies connected to the wider Atlantic world, though life within each small settlement remained simple, rooted in necessity. Clothing and appearance. Clothing in New England was plain, yet practical. Men wore breeches, linen shirts, and woolen coats. Their hats were broad-brimmed, their shoes sturdy, often with simple buckles. Women wore long gowns with aprons, their hair covered with white linen caps. Colors were muted, brown, gray, dark blue, reflecting the Puritan taste for modesty. Bright or flashy garments were rare and sometimes frowned upon as signs of vanity. Children wore smaller versions of adult clothing, but there was little room for indulgence. Every garment was valued, patched, and repatched until it could be worn no more. Illness and medicine. Life in the colonies was often shadowed by sickness. Harsh winters brought frostbite and fevers. Poor diet led to scurvy or weakness. Smallpox and other diseases swept through the settlements, taking lives suddenly and mercilessly. Doctors were few and their knowledge limited. Most cures came from the earth itself: herbal teas, poultices, and salves. Willow bark was used for pain, peppermint for stomach troubles, chamomile for rest. Many remedies were passed down through families or learned from native tribes who had long studied the healing power of plants. Still, survival often depended not on medicine but on endurance, faith, and luck. First encounters with native people. The forests and rivers of New England were not empty. They were home to native tribes who had lived there for countless generations. For the settlers, the native people were both a source of fear and a lifeline. At first, mistrust was common. The colonists were strangers, their ways unfamiliar. Yet in time, friendships grew. The native people taught the settlers how to plant corn, how to fertilize the soil with fish, and how to survive the harsh winters. There were exchanges of food, tools, and knowledge. Without this help, the colonists might not have survived. Yet tensions also arose as the newcomers claimed more land, cutting into the forests and fields the native people had long used. These early encounters set the stage for a complex relationship, sometimes peaceful, sometimes hostile, that would shape the future of New England for generations. Evening in the village. As day fades, the settlement grows quiet. Chickens are gathered into their coops. Tools are set aside. Smoke curls gently from chimneys, carrying the smell of stew and bread. Inside the homes, families sit together by firelight. Men speak softly of crops and fences. Women mend clothes by the glow of a single candle. Children listen drowsily as their mothers read from worn Bibles or whispered gentle prayers. Outside, the forest looms dark, the sound of crickets filling the air. The night is cool, the stars sharp above the clearing. Another day has ended in New England, hard, uncertain, yet filled with quiet determination. Laws, festivals, neighbors, and order. Laws and order in the colonies. In 17th century New England, order was seen as essential for survival. Without strong rules, the fragile settlements might collapse into chaos. And so, the colonists built their society on strict laws, many drawn from their religious beliefs. The laws governed almost every aspect of life. There were rules about church attendance. Missing a Sunday service could bring a fine. Rules against idleness kept people working, for laziness was considered sinful. Even clothing was regulated, to discourage vanity and pride. Justice was swift, and punishments often public. A thief might be whipped before the community. Someone who spread false rumors could be forced to stand in the stocks, their head and hands locked in wooden boards while neighbors looked on. More serious crimes, blasphemy, witchcraft, rebellion, brought harsher sentences, sometimes even death. The settlers believed these punishments not only corrected wrongdoers, but also reminded the community of the importance of discipline and obedience. Hardy popper festivals and gatherings. Though life was strict and hard, the colonists were not without joy. From time to time, the settlement came alive with celebrations. At harvest time, after a month of toil in the fields, families gathered for feasts. Long tables were set outdoors, filled with roasted meats, baked bread, pumpkins, and apples. There was laughter, prayer, and gratitude. The harvest festival was not only about food, but about survival. It meant they had lived through another year and had hope for the winter ahead. Weddings were also occasions of joy. The whole community attended, for each marriage strengthened the colony. Music played on simple instruments, and dancing filled the evening hours. For a time, the weight of hardship lifted, replaced by the warmth of fellowship. Even funerals, though somber, were communal. Neighbors walked together behind the coffin, carrying lanterns through the dim woods to the burial ground. In sorrow, as in joy, the community stood as one. Houses, neighbors, and community bonds. The bond between neighbors was strong, born of necessity. A family could not survive alone. When a new house was to be built, men gathered to raise the wooden frame together. When sickness struck, women prepared food and tended the children of the afflicted. Trust and cooperation were essential. Tools were shared, fields were harvested side by side, and dangers were faced together. A lone wolf might be hunted by many, and a wandering traveler would be offered shelter. For tomorrow it might be one's own kin who needed the same. Yet, community also meant watchfulness. People noticed one another's behavior. A family that skipped worship or a man who spoke too boldly might find themselves whispered about. In a small settlement, nothing remained hidden for long. Classical building, early political life. Even in their small beginnings, the colonists built systems of governance. Town meetings became a hallmark of New England life. In these gatherings, men of the settlement came together to discuss issues, dividing land, repairing fences, appointing watchmen, or raising funds for the meeting house. Voices rose in debate, decisions were made by vote, and responsibility was shared. These meetings planted the seeds of self-government, long before America itself was born. Though women and children did not have a voice in these councils, their presence was still felt, for the choices of the town shaped the lives of every family within it. Scroll the weight of discipline. Life in New England carried with it a constant weight of discipline. The Puritans who settled there believed they were building not only homes, but a holy community. Every action was judged in light of Scripture. Children were taught early to fear idleness and pride. Adults lived under the gaze of their neighbors and their ministers. Even leisure was measured carefully, lest it slip into sin. And yet, within this discipline there was strength. It bound the community together, kept order in harsh conditions, and gave the settlers a sense that their struggle had meaning, that they were building a society pleasing to God. Crescent moon night after the gathering. Picture the settlement after a town meeting or a harvest feast. The noise has faded, and the people return slowly to their homes. Lanterns swing in the night air. Smoke curls upward from chimneys. The forest presses close around the small circle of cabins. Inside, families settle once more by their fires. Children drift into sleep. Parents speak softly of the day's events. Outside, the stars gleam cold and distant above the dark New England woods. In this mixture of joy and burden, of discipline and fellowship, the community continues its slow shaping, carving out a life in a world both harsh and full of promise. Food, farming tools, and crafts. The rhythm of farming. Life in 17th century New England followed the rhythm of the land. The seasons dictated every task, from planting to harvest, and survival depended on careful planning. In spring, as the frost melted, fields were cleared. Men guided heavy wooden plows pulled by oxen, cutting furrows into the dark soil. Seeds of corn, beans, and squash were pressed carefully into the earth. Often, fish were buried alongside the seeds, a method taught by native people to fertilize the soil and strengthen the crop. Summer brought long hours beneath the hot sun. Weeds were pulled, fences repaired, and watch was kept for pests or wandering animals. The fields stretched green, promising food for the year ahead. Autumn was the busiest season. Families worked together to harvest corn, stack hay, and gather pumpkins and apples. Barns were filled, storage pits were dug, and every hand, young or old, was needed. Winter was a time of waiting. Snow covered the fields, and the earth rested. Families relied on what had been stored, praying that their supplies would last until the cycle began again. The food they ate, the colonists' diet was simple, yet nourishing. Corn was at the center of many meals, ground into meal for porridge, baked into bread, or boiled into pudding. Beans, peas, and squash added variety, while gardens provided cabbages, onions, and carrots. Meat came from hunting and livestock. Venison was prized, along with wild turkey, rabbit, and pigeon. Pigs and chickens provided steady supplies of pork and eggs. Cows gave milk, churned into butter, or made into cheese. Fish was abundant. Cod, herring, and mackerel were caught in the cold Atlantic waters, then salted and dried for long keeping. In rivers and streams, settlers pulled in trout and eels. Meals were plain. A family might share a pot of stew made with meat, beans, and root vegetables, or a simple loaf of bread with butter. Spices were rare, but herbs from the garden, sage, thyme, rosemary, added flavor. At the table, manners were modest. Food was often eaten from wooden trenchers or simple pewter plates. Knives and spoons were used, but forks were scarce. Each meal was a reminder of the hard labor that had brought food to the table, preserving for winter. Survival through the harsh New England winter required foresight. Every autumn, families worked tirelessly to preserve what they had gathered. Meat was smoked in small sheds, hanging from beams above slow-burning fires. Fish was salted and packed into barrels. Apples were dried in thin slices, strung along ropes near the hearth. Pumpkins and squash were stored in cool cellars, their hard skins keeping them fresh for months. Butter was packed into crocks of brine. Grain was stored in sacks and guarded carefully from rodents. Nothing was wasted. Every crumb, every scrap was saved. For in January or February, when snow lay deep and the nights grew long, these stores meant life or death, tools of survival. The settlers' tools were simple but essential. Axes chopped the endless supply wood needed for homes and fires. Saws cut beams for houses. Hammers and nails, though precious, built the very framework of the colony. In the fields, wooden plows broke the soil. Hoes and sickles harvested the crops. Every tool was used until worn smooth, then repaired, sharpened, or reshaped to last longer. Within the home, iron pots hung over the hearth. Wooden bowls, mugs, and trenchers served meals. Spinning wheels turned wool into yarn. Looms wove yarn into cloth. Each tool had a purpose, and each was valued. A broken plow could mean a failed harvest. A missing axe could leave a family cold. To the settlers, tools were treasures, as vital as food itself. Crafts and domestic work. Alongside farming, the colonists crafted much of what they needed. Women spun wool from sheep, dyed it with plants, and wove it into fabric. They sewed clothing by hand, patching and mending until garments could be worn no more. Men worked with wood, shaping barrels, carts, and furniture. Carpenters built sturdy tables, chairs, and bedsteads. Blacksmiths forged nails, hinges, and simple tools, their forges glowing red in the twilight. Children learned these crafts early. A boy might watch his father shape a handle for an axe. A girl might sit by her mother, carding wool or threading a needle. Each skill was passed from one generation to the next, weaving together the knowledge that sustained the colony. Markets and exchange. Though money was scarce, small markets appeared in villages. Farmers brought baskets of produce, jars of honey, or bundles of wool. Fishermen offered salted cod, while hunters sold pelts of beaver and fox. Neighbors gathered not only to trade, but to share news. A market day was as much a social gathering as an exchange of goods. Laughter mixed with bargaining. Children played in the dust, and for a moment, the harshness of daily life softened into fellowship. Over time, trade with England grew. Ships carried furs, lumber, and fish across the Atlantic, and returned with cloth, iron tools, and books. The colonies, though far from the old world, remained connected to it through the steady rhythm of trade, evening after the day's labor. As the sun sank, casting long shadows across the fields, the day's labor ended. Tools were gathered, animals fed, and fires lit in every hearth. Inside, the evening meal was shared, a simple stew, bread warm from the coals, perhaps a slice of dried apple. Afterward, women spun wool by firelight, their spinning wheels humming softly. Men repaired tools, their hands steadying the glow. Children dozed, their eyes heavy, their minds filled with the stories whispered by their parents. Outside, the fields lay quiet, resting for another day. The forest rustled softly with the movements of unseen creatures. Above, the stars burned cold and bright, eternal witnesses to the fragile human lives below. In that quiet, the colonists found both weariness and peace. Another day had passed, and tomorrow the rhythm would begin again. Faith, fear, and conflict. The Puritan faith. At the very center of New England life in the 1600s was religion. The settlers had crossed the ocean not only for land, but for the freedom to build a society rooted in their faith. They were Puritans, men and women who sought to live strictly by the word of God. The church was not merely a place of worship. It was the heart of the community, the gathering place and the voice of authority. On Sundays, bells rang out across the fields, calling every family to the meeting house. Attendance was expected, indeed required. The services were long and solemn. Ministers preached for hours, their voices rising and falling as they warned against sin and urged obedience to God's will. Children fidgeted on hard wooden benches. Women sat with heads bowed, and men listened with stern faces. Religion shaped every law, every custom, and every decision. To the Puritans, life itself was a test, a constant struggle to prove worthiness before God. The Sabbath and discipline. The Sabbath was sacred. From sundown on Saturday to sundown on Sunday, work ceased. Fields lay quiet, tools rested, and even cooking was kept simple. Any labor was frowned upon, for the day belonged to God. Breaking the Sabbath could bring punishment. A man caught chopping wood, or a woman seen spinning yarn, might face fines or public shame. Even children were expected to remain solemn, avoiding play or laughter. This strictness created a society of discipline. Every colonist lived under constant watch, not only of the ministers and magistrates, but of their neighbors. To disobey was not merely to break a rule, but to betray the very foundation of the community. Fear of sin and the devil. Hand in hand with faith came fear. The Puritans believed that the devil was ever near, seeking to tempt, to deceive, and to destroy. Misfortune, a failed crop, a sudden sickness, a house fire, was often seen as a sign of sin or Satan's hand. This fear kept people vigilant. It also bred suspicion. A neighbor who behaved oddly, a woman who muttered to herself, a child who fell sick. These might be whispered about as signs of witchcraft. The belief that unseen forces moved in the dark, woods around them haunted the settlers' minds. The Puritan world was full of invisible battles between God and the devil, angels and demons, righteousness and corruption. To live in New England was to live in constant awareness of these unseen powers. Encounters with Native Americans. Beyond the edge of the settlement stretched forests filled with native peoples, Algonquian-speaking tribes who had lived on the land for countless generations. At first, relations were mixed. Some encounters were friendly. Native guides showed the colonists how to plant corn with fish, how to hunt the woods, and how to navigate the rivers. Trade brought furs and food in exchange for iron tools, cloth, and beads. For a time, there was a fragile balance, but tension soon grew. As the colonists cleared more land, hunting grounds shrank. As villages expanded, forests disappeared. Misunderstandings deepened into mistrust. The Puritans, seeing themselves as chosen by God, often dismissed native beliefs and traditions. To the natives, the settlers appeared as intruders, pushing further each year into their ancestral lands. By the mid-1600s, conflict erupted into open violence. Raids struck isolated farms. Settlers armed themselves at night, and watchmen stood guard at the edges of towns. War flared short, bloody, and devastating for both sides. King Philip's War. The most terrible of these conflicts came in the 1670s. King Philip's War. Metacom, a Wampanoag leader called King Philip by the English, led a desperate fight to drive the settlers back. For months, villages burned, Crops were destroyed, and families lived in constant fear. Colonists huddled in fortified garrisons, while warriors struck swiftly and vanished into the forests. Entire communities were wiped out, leaving only ashes and silence. In the end, the colonists prevailed, but at terrible cost. Hundreds of settlers died, and thousands of native people were killed or sold into slavery. The war scarred New England, leaving fear and sorrow woven into its history. Faith amid hardship. Through war, famine, and fear, the Puritans clung to their faith. At night, when the forest whispered with danger and the wind rattled the shutters, families gathered by the fire. Psalms were sung, prayers whispered, and scriptures read aloud. In their minds, every hardship was a trial sent by God. To endure was to prove their devotion. To fail was to risk eternal damnation. Thus, the people of New England lived between hope and fear, hope of salvation, fear of sin, hope of community, fear of enemies, hope of God's grace, fear of the devil's snare, the shadow of the meeting house. Imagine a New England village at dusk. The meeting house stands tall at the center, its simple wooden walls bathed in fading light. Families hurry home, doors barred, candles flickering inside. In the distance, the forest looms dark and endless, a reminder of the unknown. The cries of night creatures echo through the trees. Within their homes, the colonists kneel, whispering prayers for safety, for forgiveness, for the strength to endure another day. The shadow of the meeting house stretches across the village, a symbol of both guidance and fear. In that shadow, the Puritans shaped not only their lives, but the very identity of the land that would one day become America. Family, children, and education. The colonial family. In 17th century New England, the family was a foundation of society. A household was more than a place of shelter. It was a small world of its own, where faith, discipline, and labor came together. Families were large. A couple might have 6, 8, or even 10 children, though many did not survive infancy. Every life was precious, every new birth a sign of God's blessing. Yet, with each child came responsibility, for mouths to feed and hands to guide. The father was seen as the head of the household, responsible for providing, protecting, and leading in faith. The mother managed the home, cared for the children, and ensured that the rhythms of daily life, cooking, spinning, sewing, never faltered. Together, they created a unit bound by duty and belief. Marriage and roles. Marriage was both practical and sacred. Men and women often married young, for survival required partnership. A man alone could not manage the heavy labor of farming, nor could a woman alone bear the endless tasks of household work. Together, they formed the core of the colony's strength. The husband was expected to labor in the fields, chop wood, hunt, and make decisions for the family. The wife tended the hearth, baked bread, raised poultry, and taught the children. While their roles were distinct, both were seen as serving God through their daily toil. Love was present, though not always expressed as in later times. Marriage was less about romance and more about duty, companionship, and the survival of the household. Yet in the quiet moments at the fire, during harvest, or in shared prayer, affection and tenderness lived. Children in colonial life. Children grew up quickly in New England. From the moment they could walk, they were given tasks: feeding chickens, gathering firewood, carrying water. By their teens, boys worked in the fields alongside their fathers, while girls helped their mothers at the loom or spinning wheel. Play was not absent, but it was modest. Children might roll hoops, play with carved wooden dolls, or toss a leather ball. Yet every game was watched carefully, for idleness was frowned upon. The Puritans believed that a child's soul needed firm guidance, lest it fall into sin. Discipline was strict, obedience to parents was expected, and disobedience could bring punishment. A child was taught to fear God, respect elders, and labor faithfully. Early on, they were reminded that life was short and uncertain, and that salvation must be sought even in youth. Education and literacy. One of the most striking features of New England was its commitment to education. Unlike many parts of the world at the time, the colonists placed great value on teaching children to read, so that they might read the Bible. Schools were simple, often one-room buildings with rough benches and few materials. Lessons focused on reading, writing, and memorizing scripture. The hornbook, a small wooden paddle with the alphabet and prayers printed on it, was a common tool. Boys were more likely to continue schooling, while girls often learned domestic skills at home. Yet many women, too, became literate, for the Puritan emphasis on scripture touched every soul. In 1647, Massachusetts passed the Old Deluder-Satan Act, requiring towns to establish schools. The law declared that ignorance of scripture left children vulnerable to the devil. Education, therefore, was not merely useful, it was spiritual armor, apprenticeship and work beyond basic schooling. Many boys entered apprenticeships. A young boy might live a blacksmith, a cooper, or a carpenter, learning a trade for several years. In return, he was given food, shelter, and training, and when grown, the chance to set up his own craft. Girls learned by watching and helping their mothers, cooking, sewing, spinning, and keeping house. By the time of marriage, a young woman was expected to manage a household with skill and discipline. Work was not seen as separate from education, but as part of it. Every task, whether in field, home, or shop, was a lesson in responsibility, patience, and faith. Evenings in the family home. Picture a colonial family at day's end. The father returns from the fields, weary but steady. The mother tends a pot by the fire, stirring stew as the smell of baked bread fills the room. Children sit nearby, some carding wool, others tracing letters in the dim light. After supper, the father opens a Bible. By candlelight, verses are read aloud. The children listen, their eyes heavy with sleep, their minds filled with the solemn words. Prayers are said, and then the family retires to bed, huddled beneath quilts in small, crowded rooms. The home was not merely a shelter of wood and stone. It was a heart of colonial life, where faith was taught, discipline enforced, and love quietly endured. The family as the seed of a nation. In these small households, scattered across the rocky soil of New England, lay the seed of what would one day become America. Each family, bound by duty and guided by faith, carried forward traditions of hard work, education, and devotion. The Puritan family was strict, sometimes harsh, yet it forged resilience. It produced generations ready to endure hardship, to build communities, and to shape the destiny of a new land. Health, sickness, and healing. A world of sickness. 17th century New England was a land of hardship, and sickness was one of its greatest enemies. The cold winters, damp houses, and hard labor made colonists vulnerable to illness. Colds, fevers, and infections spread quickly, while diseases like smallpox, measles, and dysentery could devastate entire communities. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly high. Many children died before reaching their first birthday, and mothers often faced danger in childbirth. Families lived with the constant shadow of death, never knowing which season might bring sorrow. Without modern medicine, even small wounds could prove fatal. A cut from an axe, left untreated, might become infected. A simple cough could turn into a deadly illness. Life was fragile, and every breath was a gift. Remedies and folk medicine, with doctors scarce and expensive, most families relied on home remedies. Gardens were filled with medicinal herbs. Sage for sore throats, chamomile for stomach pains, mint for fevers. Women, especially mothers and midwives, carried the knowledge of healing. They brewed teas, prepared poultices, and whispered prayers as they worked. Honey was used to soothe wounds, garlic to ward off infection, willow bark for pain. Some cures were based on superstition. Charms were carried to protect against illness, and strange mixtures were sometimes prescribed by traveling healers. Faith and medicine were often intertwined. For many, sickness was not only physical but also spiritual. The role of midwives. Midwives held a place of deep importance. In a world where childbirth was risky, these women brought skill, courage, and comfort. They guided mothers through labor, cut the cord, and bathed the newborn. Their knowledge came not from books, but from experience passed down through generations. Herbs to ease pain, oils to soothe, whispered encouragements. These were their tools. Yet midwives sometimes faced suspicion. When a birth went wrong, whispers of witchcraft could arise. A woman too skilled or too mysterious might find herself accused rather than praised. In this way, even healing could become dangerous. Doctors in early medicine professional doctors were few, and their treatments were often harsh. Bloodletting was common, based on the belief that illness came from imbalances in the body's humors. Leeches were applied, veins opened, and patients weakened in the hope of being cured. Other methods included purging with strong herbs or minerals, inducing vomiting, or administering harsh tonics. Some cures helped, but many harmed more than they healed. Still, doctors carried authority. Their Latin terms, their heavy books, and their rare instruments impressed the colonists, even if the results were uncertain. For many, to call a doctor was a last resort, when home remedies and prayers had failed. The spiritual battle of illness. To the Puritans, sickness was not only a bodily ailment, but also a test of the soul. A fever might be punishment for sin or a trial sent by God. Ministers visited the sick, urging confession, repentance, and prayer. Families knelt by sickbeds, reading psalms aloud, seeking not only healing but forgiveness. When death came, it was faced with solemn faith, the body buried in simple graves, the soul entrusted to God. Death and burial. Death was ever present in New England. Graveyards stood close to meeting houses, their rough stones carved with skulls, angels, and warnings of mortality. Children grew up walking past these reminders each week, learning early that life was short and eternity long. Funerals were plain, but deeply communal. Neighbors gathered, prayers were spoken, and the body laid to rest in the cold earth. The colony mourned together, for in a small community, every death was felt by all. A quiet night in the sick room. Picture a New England home in winter. A child lies pale upon a bed, breath shallow, fever burning. The mother sits beside, a bowl of cool water and a cloth in her hands. The father reads softly from the Bible, his voice trembling with both faith and fear. A candle flickers, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, snow falls in silence. Inside, the family prays, some for healing, some for strength, all for mercy. Such scenes were common in 17th century New England, where health was fragile and every life hung in the balance between earth and heaven. Strength through suffering. Despite sickness, the colonists endured. Their hardships forged resilience. Each loss deepened their faith. Each recovery brought gratitude, and each season of health was cherished as a gift. Out of this suffering grew a culture of endurance, one that valued hard work, community, and unshakable belief. In the face of constant illness, the Puritans learned to live not only for the present, but with eyes fixed firmly on eternity. Clothing and fashion, simplicity and modesty. In 17th century New England, clothing was not about luxury or display. It was about modesty, durability, and obedience to God. The Puritans believed that fancy dress encouraged pride, vanity, and sin. Thus, garments were plain, colors subdued, and style simple. Browns, grays, and dark blues were most common, though natural dyes also produced shades of green or muted red. Bright colors, lace, and adornments were rare, often frowned upon, and sometimes forbidden by law. Clothing was more than fabric. It was a statement of faith. To dress modestly was to show humility before God and respect for the community's values. Men's clothing. Men wore linen shirts, long-sleeved and plain, often reaching mid-thigh. Over these came breeches, knee-length trousers fastened with buttons or ties. Wool stockings covered the legs, tucked neatly into sturdy leather shoes or boots. A doublet or coat, usually of wool, was worn for warmth. In colder months, men wrapped themselves in heavy cloaks, sometimes lined with fur. Hats were essential. The broad-brimmed felt hat, often black, shielded from sun and rain, and gave the Puritan man his distinctive silhouette. A simple leather belt held tools or a pouch, for practicality was always near at hand. Women's clothing. Women's garment began with a shift, a long linen underdress that reached the ankles. Over this, a bodice or stays gave shape, while a skirt or petticoat completed the outfit. Aprons were worn daily, protecting skirts from the endless work of cooking and tending the home. For modesty, women covered their hair with coifs, white linen caps tied neatly under the chin. On cold days, woolen shawls or cloaks were wrapped around the shoulders. Colors were plain, but small touches of beauty appeared in careful stitching, fine weaving, or the neatness of a well-kept gown. Even in simplicity, there was dignity and grace. Children's clothing. Children dressed much like their parents, though simpler. Young boys often wore gowns, loose dresses, until they were old enough for breeches, usually around the age of 7. This moment, called breeching, was a milestone marking a boy's step toward manhood. Girls wore small versions of women's attire, shifts, skirts, and aprons, with their hair covered by caps. Clothing was handed down, patched, and repurposed many times, for fabric was precious and nothing was wasted. Making and mending clothing in New England was almost always handmade. Women spun wool from sheep or flax from fields, dyed the threads with plants, and wove cloth on wooden looms. Each garment required hours of labor, cutting, stitching, and careful shaping by hand. Shoes were crafted by cobblers, but many families repaired their own. Knitting produced stockings and mittens. Every scrap of fabric found use, whether as patches, rags, or quilts. Garments were worn until they could no longer be mended. A coat might serve a father, then a son, then be cut down for a child. Each stitch told the story of endurance and thrift, sumptuary laws and control. In some colonies, leaders even passed sumptuary laws, rules that forbade people from dressing above their station. A farmer could not wear fine lace, nor could a craftsman don silk. These laws reflected the Puritan desire to keep society orderly, humble, and free from excess. Though some chafed under these restrictions, most obeyed, for to defy was to invite suspicion and shame. In New England, dress was not simply personal. It was public, a sign of obedience to the community's values. Clothing through the seasons. The harsh climate shaped what people wore. In summer, lighter linen garments offer relief from heat, though modesty ensured that bodies remained covered. In winter, layers of wool and fur were essential against the biting cold. Mittens, hoods, and thick stockings became daily necessities. Fires warmed homes, but outside, the wind cut deep, and only heavy cloaks or blankets could keep the chill at bay. The symbolism of dress. Clothing carried meaning beyond its fabric. A neat, plain outfit signaled discipline and devotion. A patched garment spoke of thrift and endurance. A white cap on a woman's head showed modesty, while a black hat on a man marked dignity and seriousness. Together, these garments shaped the image of the New England Puritan, sober, disciplined, and steadfast. Their clothing was not meant to dazzle, but to declare their purpose, to live a life humble before God and prepare for hardship. A family by the fire. Imagine a family in their home at night. A mother sits by the hearth, mending a worn sleeve with careful stitches. Beside her, a daughter spins wool, the wheel humming softly. The father, in his plain coat, reads from the Bible, while sons polish their boots for the next day's labor. The garments they wear are simple, patched, and plain. Yet in their plainness lies strength, the strength of a people who chose endurance over comfort, humility over pride, and faith over vanity. Leisure, music, and entertainment. A world of work and restraint. For the Puritans of 17th century New England, life was ruled by labor and devotion. Every hour was meant to serve God, whether through prayer or honest toil. Leisure was not condemned outright, but it was watched carefully. Too much play could be seen as idleness, and idleness was sin. Yet even the sternest settlers could not live without joy. Music, games, and stories slipped into daily life, sometimes in quiet ways, sometimes in moments of community celebration. Leisure was not constant, but it existed, woven between work and worship. Music in daily life. Music held a strange place in Puritan society. Instruments like fiddles and flutes were sometimes seen as worldly, stirring passions rather than faith. But singing, especially psalms, was encouraged. On Sundays, voices rose together in meeting houses, though often without harmony, for the Puritans sang by the line. A leader would recite a verse, and the congregation would repeat, creating a slow, solemn rhythm. At home, families sang hymns by the hearth. Children learned verses early, their voices weaving with their parents. Though plain, this music carried power. It was worship, comfort, and community all at once. Some settlers, especially those not strictly Puritan, played fiddles or whistles in private. In taverns and gatherings, lively tunes might be heard, though such sounds were frowned upon by ministers. Even so, music, soft or spirited, found its way into colonial hearts. Storytelling by firelight. In a world without books for every child, stories passed from mouth to mouth. Elders spoke of voyages across the sea, of the hardships of winter, and of God's providence that carried them through. At night, families gathered by the fire. A father might read from the Bible, while a mother recalled memories of England. Children listened wide-eyed as tales of wolves in the forest or Indian encounters were told. Storytelling also bound the community together. Each tale carried lessons, warnings against pride, reminders of God's mercy, or encouragement in times of fear. In a new land of shadows and silence, words gave light, games and children's play. Children, though raised in discipline, still played. Their games were simple, rolling hoops, tossing balls, or playing tag in the village square. Boys carved whistles from wood. Girls made dolls from corn husks or scraps of cloth. In winter, children slid on frozen ponds, laughing despite the cold. Even Puritan parents allowed these moments, for play taught skills and gave strength for work ahead. Adults, too, sometimes joined in. Quieter pastimes like chess, drafts, checkers, and card games existed, though some leaders condemned cards as tools of chance and temptation. Still, dice and boards appeared in taverns, hidden from strict eyes. Taverns and social gatherings. Though Puritan ideals discouraged excess, taverns dotted the countryside. These houses offered food, drink, and a place for travelers to rest. Within, men exchanged news, debated politics, and sometimes sang or played games. Authorities watched carefully, for taverns could stir disorder. Yet they also knit communities together, giving neighbors a place to talk outside the strict silence of meeting houses. Festivities and holidays. The Puritans rejected many traditional holidays. Christmas, for example, was banned in Massachusetts, considered a popish invention. Dancing and feasting were discouraged. But celebrations were not absent. Harvest time brought gatherings of thanks. Families shared food, neighbors joined in work and reward, and prayer gave the occasion its solemn joy. Weddings, too, became moments of festivity. Simple, yet filled with laughter and feasting after vows were spoken. On rare occasions, the community set aside a day for Thanksgiving or fasting, called by leaders in response to events. These days carried deep emotion, reminding settlers that joy and sorrow alike were guided by God's hand. Quiet joys of the frontier. Beyond structured gatherings, there were quiet pleasures. A man might sit by his door, carving wood as the sun set. A woman might weave or knit, finding peace in the rhythm of her hands. Children lay in meadows, watching clouds drift or listening to the wind through pines. Nature itself gave entertainment. The call of birds, the rush of streams, the stars unbroken by city lights. In a world so harsh, even silence became a gift. The balance of work and play. Leisure in New England was never free of watchfulness. Ministers warned against frivolity, leaders punished excess, and families reminded children of discipline. Yet joy persisted, in song and story, in simple games. These moments did not weaken the settlers. Rather, they strengthened them, giving courage to face hardship, comfort to endure sorrow, and a touch of humanity in a life ruled by duty. A scene in the village. Picture a small New England village at dusk. Children chase one another across the square, their laughter carried on the cool air. Inside a nearby tavern, men speak in hushed voices, while fiddle plays softly. In a home by the forest, a mother tells her children a story as they sit by the fire, the glow warming their faces. Outside, the stars shine bright and the village rests. Tomorrow will bring labor again, but tonight, in these brief hours, joy has its place. Health, medicine, and survival. Microbe illness in the colonies. Life in 17th century New England was harsh, and illness was ever present. The cold winters, damp wooden homes, and hard labor made colonists vulnerable. Common ailments included fevers, smallpox, measles, dysentery, and respiratory infections. Infant mortality was tragically high, and childbirth posed serious risks to mothers. Even minor injuries, left untreated, could become deadly infections. Survival was uncertain, and every illness reminded settlers of life's fragility. Herb folk remedies. With few professional doctors, most families relied on home remedies. Herbs grown in gardens were essential. Sage for sore throats, chamomile for stomach aches, mint for fevers, and willow bark for pain. Mothers and midwives prepared poultices, teas, and salves. Honey was used to heal wounds, while garlic fought infection. Folk medicine combined practical knowledge with spiritual belief. Prayers and blessings were often included in treatment. Woman, baby bottle midwives, and childbirth. Midwives played a critical role. They guided mothers through labor, cut the umbilical cord, and cared for newborns. Their skills came from experience passed down through generations, often without written instructions. Yet midwives sometimes faced suspicion. If a birth went wrong, communities might whisper of witchcraft. Despite this, their knowledge was vital, and their presence often determined survival of both mother and child. Medical symbol early doctors. Professional physicians were rare and treatments were rudimentary. Bloodletting was common, based on the belief that illness stemmed from imbalances in the body's humors. Leeches, purges, and strong herbal tonics were frequently used. Doctors' methods often did more harm than good, but their authority was respected. Calling a doctor was expensive and usually a last resort, used only when home remedies failed. Balance scale, the spiritual aspect of healing. The Puritans believed illness was not only physical, but also spiritual. Disease could be a punishment for sin or a test from God. Ministers visited the sick, offering prayers, counsel, and scripture readings. Families prayed at the bedside, seeking divine intervention along with practical remedies. Death was accepted as a part of life. Graveyards stood near meeting houses, reminding everyone of mortality. Funerals were solemn and communal, reinforcing the bonds of the small community. Candle surviving harsh conditions. Despite disease and injury, the colonists endured. Their resilience came from preparation, community support, and faith. Winter stores of food, home remedies, and shared knowledge of healing helped families survive. Health was fragile, yet each recovery strengthened the settlers, teaching them to value life, labor, and community. They faced illness with courage and accepted suffering as part of God's plan. Crescent moon night in the sick room. Imagine a dimly lit home. A child lies feverish on a bed, while the mother carefully applies a poultice. The father reads a comforting passage from the Bible. Candlelight flickers across the walls, shadows dancing as snow falls silently outside. In these quiet moments, survival depended on skill, faith, and sheer endurance. Every breath, every care taken, was a small victory in a world of constant uncertainty. Health, medicine, and survival. Microbe illness in the colonies. Life in 17th century New England was harsh, and illness was ever present. The cold winters, damp wooden homes, and hard labor made colonists vulnerable. Common ailments included fevers, smallpox, measles, dysentery, and respiratory infections. Infant mortality was tragically high, and childbirth posed serious risks to mothers. Even minor injuries, left untreated, could become deadly infections. Survival was uncertain, and every illness reminded settlers of life's fragility. Herb folk remedies. With few professional doctors, most families relied on home remedies. Herbs grown in gardens were essential. Sage for sore throats, chamomile for stomach aches, mint for fevers, and willow bark for pain. Mothers and midwives prepared poultices, teas, and salves. Honey was used to heal wounds, while garlic fought infection. Folk medicine combined practical knowledge with spiritual belief. Prayers and blessings were often included in treatment. Woman, baby bottle midwives, and childbirth. Midwives played a critical role. They guided mothers through labor, cut the umbilical cord, and cared for newborns. Their skills came from experience passed down through generations, often without written instructions. Yet midwives sometimes faced suspicion. If a birth went wrong, communities might whisper of witchcraft. Despite this, their knowledge was vital, and their presence often determined survival of both mother and child. Medical symbol early doctors. Professional physicians were rare and treatments were rudimentary. Bloodletting was common, based on the belief that illness stemmed from imbalances in the body's humors. Leeches, purges, and strong herbal tonics were frequently used. Doctors' methods often did more harm than good, but their authority was respected. Calling a doctor was expensive and usually a last resort, used only when home remedies failed. Balance scale, the spiritual aspect of healing. The Puritans believed illness was not only physical, but also spiritual. Disease could be a punishment for sin or a test from God. Ministers visited the sick, offering prayers, counsel, and scripture readings. Families prayed at the bedside, seeking divine intervention along with practical remedies. Death was accepted as a part of life. Graveyards stood near meeting houses, reminding everyone of mortality. Funerals were solemn and communal, reinforcing the bonds of the small community. Candle surviving harsh conditions. Despite disease and injury, the colonists endured. Their resilience came from preparation, community support, and faith. Winter stores of food, home remedies, and shared knowledge of healing helped families survive. Health was fragile, yet each recovery strengthened the settlers, teaching them to value life, labor, and community. They faced illness with courage and accepted suffering as part of God's plan. Crescent moon night in the sick room. Imagine a dimly lit home. A child lies feverish on a bed, while the mother carefully applies a poultice. The father reads a comforting passage from the Bible. Candlelight flickers across the walls, shadows dancing as snow falls silently outside. In these quiet moments, survival depended on skill, faith, and sheer endurance. Every breath, every care taken, was a small victory in a world of constant uncertainty.